Before we begin this story, please leave your support here on the channel. If you like real mysteries, dark stories, and secrets that have remained hidden for decades, take advantage now and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next stories we'll be bringing you. And I also want to know one thing. Where are you watching this video from? Right here in the comments, your city and your country. I love seeing how far these stories are going. Winter had arrived silently in the small town of Amityville, New York. Snow covered the roofs of the colonial houses and piled up on the empty sidewalks. During the day, the town seemed ordinary, quiet, almost peaceful. But at night, when the wind blew from the ocean and the bare trees creaked in the dark, Amityville seemed to hold ancient secrets. Among all the houses on Ocean Avenue, one always attracted longer glances. The large Dutch house with its eye-shaped windows stood imposingly at number 112. The dark wood of its facade seemed to absorb the little light from the street, and the silence around it was heavier than anywhere else in the neighborhood. It was there that Thomas Keller decided to start a new life. Thomas was 43 years old, an architect, and had moved from Manhattan after a painful divorce. He was seeking peace, stability, and distance from the chaotic city life. When he found the house for a surprisingly low price, he thought it was just luck. The broker briefly mentioned that the property had history. Thomas didn't ask any questions. He always believed that houses didn't hold memories. For him, walls were just wood and bricks, but that conviction would begin to unravel in the first few weeks. At first, everything seemed normal. Thomas renovated part of the house, cleaned out the old basement, and set up his office in one of the second-floor bedrooms. The large windows offered a view of the Amityville Creek River, which slowly froze as winter progressed. Silence was exactly what he wanted. Then the sleepless nights began. At first, he thought it was just stress. Thomas woke up at 3 a.m. every night, always at the same time. It wasn't an ordinary awakening. It was as if something had abruptly ripped him from sleep. His heart was racing. He had the strange feeling that someone was watching him. He walked through the dark house, checking the doors and windows. Nothing. Everything is quiet. Then he would go back to bed. The following morning, the exhaustion was overwhelming. As the days went by, the nights got worse. Thomas began to hear sounds. First, there were creaking sounds in the wood, something common in old houses. Then came the steps. Boards, heavy, always downstairs. He tried to ignore it, but one night, determined to end the paranoia, he went downstairs holding a metal stick he had used during the renovation. The room was empty, the kitchen too. When he opened the basement door, a damp, old smell wafted up the stairs, but there was no one there. Even so, that night he had his first unsettling certainty. The footsteps had stopped just as he reached the stairs, as if something were listening. Fatigue began to affect his work. During online meetings with clients, Thomas would lose focus. His eyes would turn red, and the deep, dark circles under his eyes caught the attention of even colleagues who hadn't seen him in years. After nearly 3 weeks of poor sleep, he decided to seek medical help. The initial diagnosis seemed simple: insomnia caused by stress. The doctor prescribed mild medication to regulate sleep. For 2 nights, the medicine worked. On the 3rd night, Thomas woke up again at 3 a.m, but this time there was something different, very different. He didn't just wake up with the feeling of being watched. He woke up with the distinct impression that I wasn't alone in the room. The air felt heavy. Property. Slowly, Thomas turned his head toward the door. The hallway was dark, but for a second, just a second, he thought he saw something move. Something disappeared when he blinked. Thomas lay motionless in bed for almost 10 minutes. The silence was absolute. Even so, he knew that the problem was no longer just about sleep. Something in the house seemed to react to his presence, and that would be just the first of many nights in which he would begin to suspect a disturbing truth. Perhaps the doctor was treating the wrong problem. Perhaps the problem if he wasn't in it. Perhaps the problem was in the house. And in Amityville, some houses hold stories that should never be awakened again. In the following days, Thomas Keller tried to maintain a normal routine. During the day, the house looked like just an old building in need of maintenance. The winter light streamed through the large living room windows, illuminating the dust particles that still lingered in the air after weeks of being abandoned. The smell of old wood and fresh paint mingled with the aroma of the coffee he brewed every morning. Nothing seemed threatening in the sunlight. That was precisely what made the nights so disturbing. Thomas began to notice details of the house that had previously gone unnoticed. The walls were thicker than is common in modern houses, and the floor creaked in certain specific spots, as if hiding hollow spaces between the beams. Some doors had old locks, different from those installed in the rest of the house, suggesting that parts of the structure had been modified over the decades. One afternoon, while organizing documents in his makeshift office, he found a forgotten box at the back of a built-in cabinet. Inside were old papers, newspaper clippings, yellowed by time. Thomas hesitated before reading, but curiosity won out. The first excerpt mentioned a crime that had occurred in the house decades earlier. The text described a case that had shocked the entire region. An entire family murdered in the middle of the night. The street name was the same, Ocean Avenue. The house number as well. Thomas stood still for several seconds, staring at the paper. He vaguely remembered hearing something about it when he bought the house, but the realtor had dealt with the subject quickly, almost awkwardly. Another clipping mentioned something even stranger. Later, residents reported unusual behavior inside the house, constant insomnia, feeling of being watched, noises during the early morning hours. Thomas felt a growing unease. That was exactly what was happening to him. He slammed the box shut. He didn't believe in supernatural stories. To him, it was probably just a coincidence, amplified by the macabre reputation of the house. Even so, that night, as the clock approached 3 a.m, Thomas realized he had been waiting for the moment, and he arrived. 3 hours. Exactly. Thomas woke up as if he had been shoved out of his sleep. The room was plunged into darkness. But something had changed. This time, the steps started again. Downstairs, clearer than before, boards dragged. Thomas lay there for a few seconds, trying to convince himself that it was just the wind or the expansion of the wood in the intense cold. But the footsteps continued, one, other, and one more. He got out of bed, his heart racing. Upon opening the bedroom door, the hallway was silent. Only the dim light from the street filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Thomas went down the stairs slowly. Each step creaked under his feet. When he reached the room, the footsteps had stopped again. The silence was almost oppressive. But something caught his attention. The kitchen door was open. He was certain he had closed it before going to sleep. Thomas crossed the room slowly. Upon entering the kitchen, he noticed something else. The basement door was also open, and he clearly remembered locking it. A cold, damp air rose from the darkness below. Thomas stood in the doorway for a few seconds. Then he turned on the light on the staircase. The basement looked exactly as he had left it after the renovation. Tools organized, boxes stacked, and the old boiler in the corner. But there was something strange about the concrete floor. Brands, as if someone had walked there with wet feet. Thomas descended slowly. The footprints led all the way to the center of the basement, and they simply disappeared. There was no way back. No logical explanation. He stared at the ground for long seconds, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps it was a leak, perhaps an animal, but something inside him was beginning to resist those explanations. The following morning, Thomas decided to leave the house for a few hours. He went to a small cafe near the center of town. The place was frequented mainly by long-time residents of Amityville. While having coffee, he casually mentioned where he was living. The reaction was immediate. A lady who was sitting at the next table slowly turned her head. Her gaze seemed to mix curiosity and concern. "Do you live in that house?" she asked. Thomas confirmed. The woman remained silent for a few seconds before speaking again. People always think they can live there. Thomas tried to laugh it off, as if it were just a local superstition, but the lady continued. Everyone starts by saying they don't believe these stories. She then added something that made Thomas's stomach clench, until they start waking up at 3 in the morning. Thomas did not answer, because at that moment he realized something unsettling. For the first time since moving to Amityville, he began to consider a possibility that until then had seemed absurd. Perhaps the house wasn't just old. Perhaps something inside her was still present, and perhaps that something had noticed that he was there. After the conversation at the cafe, Thomas Keller returned home with an uneasy feeling that he couldn't ignore. All the way down Ocean Avenue, he kept repeating to himself that it was just small-town superstition. Amityville had become famous for exaggerated stories, and long-time residents often fueled that kind of narrative. It was easy for people to turn coincidences into legends. Still, when he parked the car in front of the house, Thomas realized he had been standing still inside the vehicle for a few seconds, observing. The windows were dark, the roof was covered in snow, a silent facade. The house seemed to be watching him back. He shook his head, annoyed with himself, and got out of the car. For the rest of the afternoon, he decided to keep his mind occupied. He worked on pending projects, reviewed architectural plans, and made a few calls with clients. The activity helped to push away the strange thoughts that had arisen after reading the newspaper clippings. But as night approached, the house began to look different again, quieter, heavier. At 10 o'clock at night, Thomas locked all the doors and checked the windows. It was something he had never done so meticulously before moving there. Before going to sleep, he decided to take the medication that the doctor had prescribed. Maybe that would solve everything. Perhaps the problem was purely psychological. For a few hours the medicine worked, but at 3 in the morning he woke up again. This time there was no gradual transition from sleep to consciousness. It was like being pulled back to reality, violently. Thomas opened his eyes in the dark, and he immediately realized something was wrong. The bedroom door was open. He was absolutely certain that he had closed it. His heart began to beat faster. The hallway was completely dark, but a shadow seemed to be moving slowly in the background, near the stairs. Thomas blinked several times, trying to adjust his vision. The shadow disappeared. Silence. Then the sound started again. Steps. But this time they weren't downstairs. They were in the hallway, outside the room. Boards, heavy, dragged. Each footstep seemed to echo throughout the entire house. Thomas remained motionless in bed. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. The silence that followed was even worse. He clearly sensed that something was there, something stalled, something waiting for. The seconds seemed to drag on. Then, suddenly, a dry crack echoed down the hallway, as if someone had pressed down on the wooden floor. Thomas couldn't take it any more. He stood up quickly and turned on the light. The hallway was empty. No shadow, no movement, nothing. Even so, he went all the way up the top floor, opening every door. Guest room, bathroom, desk. Everything is empty. When he went downstairs to check the rest of the house, he found something that made his stomach churn. The front door was unlocked, slowly opened. The cold morning wind seeped in through the crack. Thomas stood there staring at it. He was absolutely certain that he had locked it. This time the fear began to take on a different form. Perhaps that wasn't just my imagination. Perhaps someone was actually breaking into the house during the night. The following morning, Thomas made a decision. I would install security cameras. As an architect, he was used to working with residential technology. It didn't take him long to install 3 cameras. One in the living room, one in the kitchen, and another facing the upstairs hallway. If someone was breaking into the house, he would find out. That night, Thomas tried to go to bed earlier. The accumulated fatigue of the past few weeks was already beginning to affect his concentration and mood. When the clock struck 3 in the morning again, he woke up, but this time something was different. No sound, no steps. The house was completely silent. Absolute silence. Thomas remained lying down for a few minutes, waiting to hear something. Nothing. The calm was strange, almost suspicious. The following morning, he went straight to check the camera recordings. Sitting in front of his computer in the office, Thomas began to advance through the images. Hours of silence. The room was empty. The kitchen is empty. The dark hallway. Then the recording clock struck 59 a.m. Thomas leaned forward. And then he saw. The hallway camera captured something that made his blood run cold. His bedroom door opened slowly, but there was nobody there. The doorknob turned by itself. The door moved slowly, and it opened. Thomas stood motionless, staring at the screen, but that wasn't the worst part yet, because a few seconds later, something else happened. Something that made Thomas realize that perhaps he had made a huge mistake in moving into that house. To the 3:00 a.m., the camera captured something impossible. A dark figure appeared in the hallway. Stop, property, looking directly at the bedroom door, and he stood there for almost 2 minutes, without moving, without making any sound, before disappearing. Thomas Keller spent almost an hour watching the recording. He played the passage several times. He moved forward. It returned. He zoomed in on the image. Nothing changed the fact that was before him. The camera had recorded something he couldn't explain. The dark figure was indistinct, almost like a shadow denser than the rest of the corridor. There was no visible face, nor clear details of the body, just a still, motionless form that seemed to absorb the little light coming from the stairs. And then it would simply disappear. Thomas ran a hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. His first reaction was to look for a technical explanation. Perhaps it was a camera defect, a sensor error, light reflection, interference. He opened the recordings from the other cameras, the one in the room. Nothing. The one in the kitchen. Nothing either. No movement. No figure. Only the runner had registered that. Even so, something was bothering him. The schedule. 02:59. The door opened by itself. 03 Jew. The figure appearing. The coincidence seemed too precise. Thomas turned off his computer and walked around the house trying to act normally. He opened the windows to let in fresh air, made strong coffee, and tried to concentrate on his work. But the house looked different now, quieter, heavier, as if he had crossed some invisible boundary. During the afternoon, someone knocked on the door. He was the neighbor from the house next door, a tall man with grey hair and a tired look. "You're the new resident," he said, without much ceremony. Thomas confirmed. The man introduced himself as Richard Coleman, a resident of the street for over 30 years. He explained that he had seen the moving truck a few weeks earlier and decided to stop by to say hello. But Thomas quickly realized there was another reason. Richard stared at the house with excessive attention, as if observing signs. After a few minutes of casual conversation, Thomas mentioned something that had been bothering him. This house? Has it always had strange stories? Richard remained silent for a few seconds. His expression changed. "Have you started hearing things yet?" The question came quickly, too direct. Thomas hesitated, but she ended up replying, "Footsteps at night." Richard sighed slowly. "It always starts like this." The man walked to the balcony and stood looking out at the street for a few moments before continuing. "After the crime, several families tried to live here. Thomas already knew part of the story from newspaper clippings. Even so, he asked him to continue. "Some stayed for only a few months," Richard said. "Others didn't last more than a few weeks." Thomas crossed his arms. "And what happened to them?" Richard looked directly at him. They couldn't sleep. The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas then talked about the cameras. He didn't show the video, but he described what he had seen. Richard didn't seem surprised. In fact, it seemed to confirm something he already suspected. "Some people said they saw things too," he commented. "Things?" Richard nodded slowly. "Shadows, figures, movement in the hallway." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine, but Richard added something that made the situation even more unsettling. "But that was never the strangest thing." Thomas frowned. "So what is it?" Richard replied without hesitation. "The house changes people." Thomas remained silent. "Like this?" The neighbor rested his hands on the balcony railing. Constant irritation, insomnia, unprovoked anger. Some residents began acting in strange ways. He paused before continuing. "One of them swore that the house was trying to force him to leave." Thomas tried to laugh, but the laughter came out weak. "Houses don't do that." Richard shrugged. "Maybe not." The man then turned to leave. But before descending the steps to the balcony, he said something that echoed in Thomas's mind for the rest of the day. "If I were you, I wouldn't stay in the basement after 3 in the morning." Thomas felt a chill in his stomach. "Why?" Richard looked at the house one last time, and he replied, "Because that's where it all began." That night, Thomas tried to convince himself that it was all just psychological suggestion. Ancient stories, rumors, urban legends. Even so, when the clock approached 3 in the morning, he was already awake, waiting. The house was silent. No sound, no steps. 03 soon, nothing happened. Thomas let out a sigh of relief. Perhaps it was all really in his head. But at that exact moment, a sound came from below, from the basement, a metallic noise. It was as if something heavy had been dragged across the concrete floor. Thomas stood motionless. The sound came again, higher, dragging. "This is it." And then he realized something that made his heart race. The camera he had installed in the kitchen was turned off. The red light indicating recording had gone out. Thomas didn't remember turning it off. And the noise in the basement continued, dragging, as if something were moving in the darkness beneath the house. Thomas stood still in the middle of the kitchen. The sound coming from the basement continued, dragging, heavy. "This is it." The echo of the concrete made the noise seem louder than it actually was, as if something was being pulled from one side of the floor to the other. He looked at the camera again. The small red light remained off. That didn't make sense. He had installed the system himself just 2 days prior, and all the cameras were connected to the same control panel. If one stopped working, the software should have alerted him, but the computer wasn't showing any notifications. Thomas walked to the basement door. The cold air rising up the stairs seemed even more damp that night. The metallic sound ceased. Silence. A heavy silence, almost provocative. Thomas stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide whether or not to get off. Part of him just wanted to go back to his room, pretend nothing was happening, and wait for dawn. But another, more rational group insisted that they needed to verify it. If someone were actually inside the house, that could be dangerous. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. He opened the door slowly. The wooden stairs creaked under the weight of her footsteps as she descended. Each step seemed to amplify the sound of her own breathing. When he reached the last step, he pointed the flashlight towards the basement. Nothing. The tools were in place. The boxes of refurbished materials remained stacked in the corner. The old boiler remained silent. But something was different. The concrete floor looked damp again. Thomas took a few steps forward. The marks were there again, wet footprints, but now they were more numerous. It was as if someone had been walking in circles in the middle of the basement. He followed the markings with the light of his flashlight. They formed a strange pattern. Those weren't normal steps. They seemed incomplete. Some footprints were only half the size of a foot. Others seemed to be dragged along. Thomas felt a growing unease. Then the flashlight's beam revealed something he didn't remember seeing before. A small wooden door embedded in the back wall of the basement. almost hidden behind an old bookcase. He was certain that door wasn't there during the renovation. Thomas moved the bookcase with effort, scraped wood on concrete. The small door appeared completely. She was old, very old. The rusty lock looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Thomas ran his hand over the surface. There were deep marks in the wood. Scratches, as if something had tried to get out of there. He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. He forced the lock with a screwdriver that was in the toolbox. After a few seconds of effort, the lock gave way with a dry snap. The door opened slowly. A strong, ancient smell emanated from the dark space. Thomas pointed the flashlight. The compartment was small. It looked like some kind of hidden room inside the house's structure. The floor was covered in dust, but there was something at the center. A chair. Old, rusty chains were attached to the sides. Thomas felt his stomach churn. That didn't look like it was part of the original construction. It looked improvised, as if someone had created that space to keep something trapped inside. He took another step into the compartment. That's when the flashlight illuminated the walls. And Thomas froze. The walls were covered in marks, deep risks, hundreds of them. As if someone had spent years scratching the wood. Some words were also engraved, short sentences, desperate. Among them, one immediately caught his attention, written several times, with force, as if the writer were trying to leave a warning. He wakes up at 3. Thomas felt a shiver run through his entire body. He took a step back. That's when he realized something even more disturbing. The wet footprints on the basement floor didn't end there. They continued. They entered the small compartment, and they stopped right in front of the chair, but there was no trail back. Thomas stared at it, trying to process it, and then something happened. Something that completely changed his perception of what was happening in that house. The kitchen light went out. Suddenly, the basement plunged into near total darkness, illuminated only by the flashlight in his hand. At that same instant, a sound emerged behind him. One step. This is it. Heavy. At the top of the basement stairs, Thomas slowly turned the flashlight towards the stairs, and what he saw at that moment made his blood run cold, because for the first time, the figure wasn't just on camera. She was there. Stop. Watching him. Thomas Keller remained motionless inside the small, hidden compartment. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. At the top of the basement stairs, the figure remained still. High, dark, property. The dim light of the flashlight didn't reveal a clear face, only the silhouette of something that looked human, but also wrong. The contours were irregular, as if the surrounding darkness were moving along with it. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The silence was absolute. Thomas felt his heart beating so hard it seemed to echo off the basement walls. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Then the figure took a step. The sound of the wooden stairs creaking broke the silence. Another step. This is it. Heavy. Thomas instinctively retreated out of the small hidden room, keeping the flashlight pointed towards the stairs. "Is anyone there?" he managed to say, his voice hoarse. No response. The figure continued to descend, step by step. Thomas noticed something strange about the way she was moving. He didn't seem to be walking normally. The steps were shuffling, as if each movement required effort. When it finally reached the basement floor, the flashlight's light revealed a little more of its shape, and what Thomas saw made his stomach churn. The figure appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothes. Very old. The fabric was torn in several places, but the face was still impossible to distinguish. It was as if the light simply couldn't reach him. Thomas took another step back. "How did you get in here?" Silence. The figure stopped in the center of the basement, exactly where the wet footprints ended. Then something unexpected happened. The figure's head tilted slowly to the side, as if he were observing Thomas with curiosity, and at that moment, A faint sound emerged from the darkness, a whisper, weak, almost impossible to understand. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He concentrated to hear better. The voice seemed to be repeating something several times, always the same phrase, almost like a warning, or perhaps a lament. 3 hours. Thomas froze. 3 hours. The whispering continued, low, dragged. He wakes up at 3 o'clock. The lantern trembled even more in Thomas's hand. The phrase was the same one engraved on the walls of the compartment. The figure then took another step, and another. The distance between them was slowly decreasing. Thomas realized he needed to get out of there. Without taking his eyes off the figure, he began to back away toward the stairs. The basement seemed smaller now, tighter. The air is heavier. When it reached the first step, the figure stopped again. Property. The whispering ceased. Thomas climbed 2 steps quickly. When he looked back again, something had changed. The figure was closer, much closer, as if he had crossed the entire basement without him noticing. Fear took over. Thomas ran up the stairs and into the kitchen, slamming the basement door shut. He leaned against her, trying to catch his breath. Silence returned. No sound coming from below. No steps. Nothing. He stood there for several minutes, waiting. But the basement remained quiet. When she finally mustered the courage to look at the clock on the kitchen wall, she noticed something that made her blood run cold again. They were 3:17 a.m. 17 minutes had passed since he went down to the basement, but for Thomas, it seemed as if everything had happened in just a few seconds. Something was wrong, very wrong. The next morning, Thomas seemed like a different man. The dark circles under her eyes were deep, the slowest movements. He no longer tried to deny what was happening. After breakfast, he grabbed his computer and began obsessively researching the house. Old files, news, police reports. The more I read, the more disturbing the story became. The crime that had occurred there decades earlier was only the beginning. After him, several families had reported similar experiences. Insomnia, waking up at exactly 3 in the morning, footsteps in the house, figures in the corridors. Some residents had abandoned their homes in less than a month. Others suffered nervous breakdowns. But one detail caught his attention, something that rarely appeared in the most well-known news reports. One of the former residents had claimed to have found a hidden compartment in the basement, exactly as Thomas had discovered. According to the report, that space was not part of the house's original floor plan. Someone had built it later. And the reason was never officially explained. But there was a theory that Thomas couldn't forget after reading it. Some residents believed that this place was more than just a hideout. It was a prison, a place where someone had been held prisoner for a long time, perhaps years. What if that were true? Thomas began to notice something disturbing. Perhaps the figure he had seen in the basement wasn't trying to get into the house. Maybe she'd never left it. Thomas Keller spent the rest of the morning sitting in front of the computer. The screen was filled with files, old news reports, and scanned documents. Some were difficult to read, imperfect scans of local newspapers from the 1970s and 1980s. Others were accounts from residents who had lived in the house for short periods, but there was a clear pattern. Almost everyone mentioned the same thing: waking up at 3 in the morning, steps, whispers, dark figures. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. For the first time since moving to Amityville, he was no longer trying to find immediate rational explanations. Something was happening in that house, and ignoring that clearly wasn't working. He needed to understand. Among the documents he found, one caught his attention. It was a short article published in a local newspaper many years after the famous crime that had made the house known. The text briefly mentioned a man named Arthur Bell. According to the article, Arthur had bought the house a few years after it was put up for sale again. He only stayed there for 3 months. But the reason for his departure was unusual. Arthur claimed he had discovered something in the basement, something that no one had ever told him. Thomas opened another file and found a short interview that Arthur had given before disappearing from public life. The final part of the interview made Thomas lean forward in his chair. Arthur said, "The house doesn't create it. It only keeps it imprisoned." Thomas reread the sentence several times. Keep him in custody. His thoughts immediately returned to the small, hidden compartment, to the chair with chains, to the marks on the walls, and to the phrase recorded repeatedly, "He wakes up at 3." Thomas realized he needed to go back to the basement, not to prove that it was all imagination, but to understand what was really happening. For the rest of the afternoon, he began to prepare. He installed 2 more cameras, one pointed directly at the basement door and another inside the basement itself, aimed at the small hidden compartment. He also left the computer recording everything in real time. If something like that happened again, he would have clear proof. As night fell over Amityville, the tension inside the house seemed stronger than ever. Thomas noticed something curious. The more he accepted that there was something strange there, the less immediate fear he felt. The panic of the previous nights was beginning to be replaced by a quiet determination. If that house held a secret, he was going to find out. At 2:45 in the morning, Thomas was already awake, sitting in the living room, observing the images from the cameras. The house was completely silent. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked away the seconds slowly. 2:58. Thomas felt his heart race. 02:59. The image from the hallway camera shook slightly, not like an electrical fault, but as if something had passed very close to the lens. Thomas leaned forward. 03. G. The basement camera recorded movement. The door to the hidden compartment opened by itself, slowly. Very slowly. Thomas held his breath. The flashlight he had left in the basement turned on automatically with the motion sensor. The light revealed the interior of the small room, the chair, the currents, the marks on the walls, and then something began to emerge from the darkness, the same figure, but this time Thomas noticed something new. She wasn't coming from the basement. She was leaving from inside the compartment. Step by step, the figure crawled out. The head is tilted, slow movements. It's as if I were waking up from a deep sleep. Thomas watched everything on the screen, his heart racing, but something caught his attention. The figure did not appear to be looking at the camera. She seemed to be looking up, towards the room, in his direction. Then something even more disturbing happened. The figure slowly raised its arm, and he pointed directly to the basement stairs, as if calling someone, or by inviting, or giving a warning. At that same instant, a sound echoed through the house, coming from below, from the basement. A loud knock on the door. Thomas froze. Another hit, stronger. The camera showed the figure standing in the middle of the basement. Property. But the sound continued. Beats, heavy, violent, coming from inside the hidden compartment. Thomas felt a chill run through his entire body, because at that moment he realized something impossible. If the figure was outside, so there was something else is still trapped inside. Thomas Keller stood motionless before the monitor. The sound of the banging echoed throughout the entire house, heavy, violent, coming from the basement. On screen, the camera clearly showed the figure standing still in the center of the room. It didn't move, didn't react, didn't look back. He just kept pointing to the stairs, as if he were waiting, as if he were saying that it was now Thomas's responsibility. Another beat exploded in the silence of the early morning. The wood of the small compartment door trembled. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Something was trying to get out of there. But the question that began to surface in his mind was even more disturbing. If that figure had left the compartment, then who or what was trapped inside now? He took a deep breath and looked at the recordings again. The video restarted a few minutes later. Doe 3. The figure had left, but the beatings only started later, minutes later, as if something had awakened after she left. Thomas realized he couldn't ignore it. If something was trying to escape from that space, he needed to know what it was. The house had already shown that ignoring the signs didn't make the problem go away. On the contrary, it seemed to be getting worse. He grabbed a brighter flashlight from the kitchen drawer. He also brought a crowbar that he had used during the house renovation. If the door to that compartment broke, he didn't want to be unarmed. The banging continued, irregular rhythm, sometimes quick, sometimes spaced out, but each one seemed stronger than the last. Thomas slowly opened the basement door. The cold air rose up the stairs again, but now there was another smell mixed in. Something metallic, old. The silence from the rest of the house contrasted sharply with the echo of the banging downstairs. He started to go down, step by step. Each step seemed heavier than the last. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight illuminated the basement. The figure continued with wings. Exactly in the same spot that appeared on camera. Stop. Property. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He expected her to disappear when he arrived. But no. She was really there, just a few meters away. The head tilted slowly again, as if he recognized her presence, but this time she didn't come closer. On the contrary, he took a step to the side, making room exactly in the direction of the hidden compartment. The banging from inside became more violent. The small door was shaking. The wood creaked under the force of whatever was trying to get out. Thomas walked slowly over there, each step accompanied by the echo of one's own heart. The figure remained standing to the side, observing. When Thomas stood before the compartment door, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The chair's chains were taut, tense, as if something had been trapped there recently. The beatings continued, stronger. The door was almost giving way. Thomas raised the crowbar. There were only two possibilities. Or something had been trapped there for decades, or perhaps that house was trying to reveal a truth that no one had yet discovered. He placed the tip of the crowbar between the door and the doorframe. He took a deep breath. The moment he began to force the wood, the figure beside him whispered something for the first time. The voice was low, dragged, but this time the words were clear, almost desperate. "Do not open." Thomas froze. The beatings continued, more violent than ever. The door began to crack, and at that moment he realized something even more disturbing. The figure's voice didn't sound like a warning. It seemed like fear, because whatever was on the other side of that door, it was something that not even that shadow wanted to be set free. Thomas Keller stood motionless before the door of the compartment. The crowbar was still pressed against the cracked wood. The banging continued. Now they were so strong that the entire door seemed to vibrate against the frame. Behind him, the dark figure remained standing, silent, but the warning still echoed in Thomas's mind. "Do not open." For a few seconds he hesitated. Instinct told me to retreat, go up the stairs, leave the house. But another part of his mind, stronger now, told him that this needed to end. That house was trapped in a cycle. Decades of fear, decades of incomplete stories. Perhaps no one had discovered the truth simply because everyone had fled before reaching that point. Thomas took a deep breath, and he pushed the crowbar even harder. The wood cracked. A loud crack echoed through the basement. The banging stopped instantly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the previous noise. Thomas glanced quickly at the figure beside him. She had moved away a few steps, as if he knew what was about to happen. Or as if he wanted to stay as far away from the door as possible. Thomas pulled the crowbar again. The wood gave way a little more. The old lock finally broke. The door opened slowly. A blast of cold air escaped from the small compartment, much colder than the rest of the basement. Thomas pointed the flashlight inside. The beam of light revealed the chair first. The chains were still attached to his arms, but now there was something about them. Something is stuck. Thomas took a step back involuntarily. The chains were wrapped around a body, a human body, skinny, extremely thin. The skin seemed almost glued to the bones, but something was wrong. Very wrong. The body did not appear to be dead. His chest moved slowly, breathing. Thomas felt his heart race. That was impossible. That body looked decades old. The clothes were almost disintegrated, but the eyes were open, looking directly at him. And then the body began to move. The chains creaked as he tried to get up from the chair. The movements were slow, discoordinated, as if the muscles hadn't been used in a long time. Thomas took another step back. My God! The creature, because it no longer looked just like a man, opened its mouth. A dry sound escaped his throat. The voice sounded broken, old, scratched by time. You opened... Thomas felt an absolute chill run through his body. The dark figure that had been in the basement began to retreat rapidly, as if he were running away. The creature in the chair pulled hard on the chains. One of them broke free from the rotten wood of the wall. The sound of metal echoed through the basement. Thomas realized something horrible at that moment. The chair was no ordinary prison. She was trapped within the structure of the house, as if someone had tried to keep that thing contained there forever. The creature finally managed to stand up. The chains, still attached to one of his arms, dragged along the ground. Her gaze remained fixed on Thomas. So much time. The voice sounded stronger now, more alive. Thomas began to back away toward the stairs, but the creature took a step, and another. Each movement seemed more natural than the last, as if he were rapidly regaining his strength. It was then that Thomas realized something even more terrifying. The creature's face began to change. The sunken features moved slowly, like wax being heated. The bones in his face were cracking. The skin stretched, and slowly, very slowly, the face began to take on a familiar shape. Thomas felt the world spin, because the face that was forming before him, it was of himself. The same format, the same eyes, the same expression. The creature smiled, a wide smile. Wrong. And then he uttered the phrase that destroyed any remaining logic in Thomas's mind. "Thank you for setting me free." At that same instant, something happened behind him. The dark figure that had observed everything ran towards the compartment, quick, desperate. She walked past Thomas and entered the small room, and before he could react, she pulled the door shut, locking himself inside. Silence returned. Thomas stood still in the middle of the basement, breathing fast, trying to understand. But when he looked again at the creature before him, she was already going up the stairs, heading towards the house, towards the world beyond, leaving Thomas alone in the basement, standing before the small, closed door. And suddenly, he heard something coming from the other side of her. Beats, desperate, like someone trying to get out. Thomas Keller stood motionless in the middle of the basement for several seconds. The sound of chains still dragging on the floor echoed up the stairs as the creature slowly climbed to the upper floor. Each step seemed to take away what little control Thomas still had over reality. He tried to run after her. He climbed 2 steps quickly, but it stopped. Something inside him told him that this would be a mistake. The creature that had emerged from the compartment didn't just look like a trapped man. She seemed like something more, something that had been waiting for that moment, something that needed to be set free. And he had done exactly that. Thomas was breathing with difficulty. Then he realized that the sound of the banging in the compartment continued, behind the small wooden door, desperate, frenetic, as if someone were begging to get out. He slowly turned the flashlight towards the door. My heart raced again. The dark figure that had thrown itself inside was now trapped, and judging by the sound, it was trying to get out. Thomas walked slowly to the compartment. The wood trembled under the force of the blows. For a moment he thought about opening it again. But then something happened. A voice came from the other side of the door, weak, tired, but far more human than anything he had heard in that house. "Don't open it." Thomas froze. The phrase was exactly the same as the one he had heard before, but now the tone was different. It was urgent, of sacrifice. If he leaves, it won't stop. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He needs a place to stay. The lantern trembled in Thomas's hand. He began to understand. Something in that house needed a host. Or perhaps a replacement, someone who would get trapped in that space, keeping things under control. The creature that had escaped was not the first. Perhaps it had never been just one person. Perhaps it was something that moved between bodies, between identities, hoping that someone would make the same mistake Thomas had made. Open the door. On the other end, the voice continued, weaker. Close the door, and don't leave the house. Thomas felt the weight of that sentence. If he let the creature escape into the world, no one would know what it was. No one would be prepared. He walked slowly to the compartment. The drumming slowed down, as if whoever was inside knew what he was thinking. Thomas looked at the staircase. The house was silent again. The creature was no longer making a sound. He had probably left, or perhaps I was expecting it, perhaps hoping he would run away. Thomas looked at the door again, for old wood, for the marks of decades of suffering. He took a deep breath, and he pushed the door all the way open, locking the compartment again. Then he dragged the bookcase back into place, blocking the entrance. Silence returned to the basement. Heavy, absolute. Thomas slowly climbed the stairs. When she got to the kitchen, the house looked different. Empty, but not silent, because out there in the middle of the street he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure was walking slowly along the sidewalk. Under the dim light of the lamppost, the same slender figure, the same old clothes, but now with his face. Thomas Keller. The creature stopped on the sidewalk. He looked directly at the house, and she smiled. Then he continued walking, disappearing into the darkness of dawn. Thomas understood something devastating at that moment. The house was no longer haunted. She was just waiting by him, because now there was only one person trapped inside it. As the months passed, the story of that mansion had already gone beyond the limits of the small community and began to circulate in regional newspapers and internet discussion forums. What had previously seemed like just a local mystery was now transforming into an enigma that intrigued curious onlookers, historians, and even independent researchers. Some people began studying old documents related to the property. Forgotten records in municipal archives began to reveal details that had never been publicly discussed. Decades earlier, that same house had already been mentioned in strange accounts. Former owners who left the place abruptly, hasty renovations, and even rumors of areas of the house that had been sealed off without clear explanation. But there was something even more disturbing. A local researcher found an old inventory of the property that described the mansion's internal structures, that simply they did not appear in current plans. Corridors that appeared to have been closed off, rooms that no longer existed, and even a small underground wing whose function had never been recorded. When these documents began circulating among amateur researchers, an inevitable question arose. Why did these parts of the house disappear from the records? Would it just be a common renovation done over the years? Or someone at some point, he tried to hide something within the mansion's own structure? Some believed it was all just an exaggeration or a historical coincidence. Old houses often undergo numerous modifications over the decades, but others were not convinced. For them, those documents were just the tip of something much bigger, an indication that the true story of that property was still far from being fully revealed. And what made it all even more unsettling was a detail that few had noticed until then. A handwritten note in the corner of one of the old documents. A short sentence. A phrase that seemed more like a warning than a simple record. This area should not be reopened. However, someone, at some point, clearly decided to ignore that warning, and that's exactly where the mystery began to get much darker. After the old documents came to light, curiosity surrounding the mansion reached its peak. What were once just rumors and local stories now seemed to point to something concrete hidden within the very structure of the house. Some independent researchers decided to examine the mansion's current floor plan more closely. By comparing the old records with the modern structure, they noticed something that would completely change how everyone viewed the property. One particular wall in the house seemed too thick for a simple interior partition. There was no apparent architectural reason for it. It was then, during a closer inspection, that they noticed minor irregularities in the finish, signs that that section had been closed off many years before. When they finally decided to open that sealed area, nobody was prepared for what they would find. Behind the wall there was a small hidden corridor completely isolated from the rest of the house. The air inside seemed stagnant for decades. Dust, old wood, and signs of age indicated that no one had entered that space for a very, very long time. But what really caused shock was what was at the end of that corridor. A small room, no windows, without any standard furniture, only old objects carefully left there, documents, closed boxes, and a few items that appeared to belong to the mansion's former owners. Some of those papers contained personal records, notes, and strange accounts that suggested something had happened there decades before, something that apparently it was hidden on purpose. The exact content of these documents has never been fully disclosed to the public. Some of the material ended up in the hands of local authorities, while other pieces simply disappeared over time. This only deepened the mystery even further. To this day, people who study the history of that property continue trying to understand what really happened inside that house. Some believe it was all just a carefully kept family secret. Others believe the truth may be far more disturbing. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of this whole story is this. The note found in the old documents was correct. Someone, in the past, really tried to ensure that that area never to be opened again. But decades later, someone opened it. And since then, the mystery of that mansion continues to raise questions that perhaps they will never have a definitive answer. Before we go, tell me something in the comments. From which city or country are you watching this video? And if you enjoy true stories full of mystery, ancient secrets, and unsettling discoveries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.